The full story of Jacob. Jacob's birth and early life. Jacob's story begins in the book of Genesis, where he is introduced as the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and the grandson of Abraham. His birth came after much prayer, as Rebekah had been barren for a time. When she finally conceived, she was pregnant with twins. Even in the womb, there was a struggle between the two brothers. Rebekah, sensing this, inquired of the Lord, and he told her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Genesis 25:23. When the time came for Rebekah to give birth, the first twin came out red and covered with hair, so they named him Esau, which means hairy. The second twin followed, grasping Esau's heel, and he was named Jacob, meaning he grasps the heel, or supplanter. As the boys grew up, they developed very different personalities. Esau was a skillful hunter and loved the outdoors, while Jacob was quieter and preferred to stay at home. Isaac, their father, favored Esau because of his love for game, while Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob and the birthright. One day, Esau came in from the fields exhausted and starving, while Jacob was cooking a pot of stew. In his desperation, Esau begged Jacob for some of the stew. Seizing the opportunity, Jacob made an audacious proposal. He would give Esau some stew in exchange for his birthright, which was the special inheritance given to the eldest son. Esau, in his hunger, agreed without much thought, selling his birthright to Jacob. This exchange would have lasting implications in both their lives. Jacob's deception for the blessing. Years later, when Isaac was old and his eyesight had grown weak, he prepared to give Esau the blessing that was customarily given to the eldest son. Isaac instructed Esau to go hunt for game and prepare a meal, after which he would bless him. Rebekah overheard this and, knowing that God had destined Jacob to lead, devised a plan for Jacob to receive the blessing instead. While Esau was away hunting, Rebekah prepared a meal and disguised Jacob in Esau's clothes. She also covered Jacob's hands and neck with goatskin so that he would feel hairy like his brother. Jacob went to his father, pretending to be Esau. Although Isaac was suspicious, since the voice sounded like Jacob's, he ultimately relied on his sense of touch and smell, which confirmed Esau's identity, or so he thought. Isaac blessed Jacob, passing on the promises of prosperity, dominion, and the covenant blessings of Abraham. When Esau returned and discovered what had happened, he was furious and vowed to kill Jacob once their father died. To protect Jacob, Rebekah sent him to her brother Laban's house in Haran, instructing him to stay there until Esau's anger subsided. Jacob's journey to Haran and encounter with God. On his journey to Haran, Jacob stopped to rest at a certain place for the night. As he slept, he had a profound vision. He saw a ladder reaching from the earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it. Above the ladder stood the Lord, who spoke to Jacob, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Genesis 28:13-14. This divine encounter marked a turning point in Jacob's life. When he awoke, he realized the place was holy, and he called it Bethel, meaning house of God. He vowed that if God would protect and bless him, he would dedicate himself to God and give him 1/10 of everything. Jacob in Haran. The struggle for wives and wealth. Jacob eventually arrived in Haran and met Rachel, the daughter of Laban. He fell in love with her, and agreed to work for 7 years to earn her hand in marriage. However, on the night of the wedding, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him his elder daughter, Leah, instead of Rachel. When Jacob confronted Laban, he explained that it was not their custom to marry off the younger daughter before the elder. Jacob agreed to work another 7 years for Rachel, and a week later, he was able to marry her as well. Jacob's family life became complicated. Leah, feeling unloved, bore Jacob several sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, who was initially barren, became envious of her sister, and gave Jacob her servant Bilhah as a surrogate. Bilhah bore Jacob 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah also gave Jacob her servant Zilpah, who bore 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Eventually, Leah had 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, as well as a daughter, Dinah. Finally, after many years, God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. She bore Jacob a son named Joseph, who would later play a critical role in the family's story. Over the years, Jacob prospered under Laban's employment, but tension grew between them due to Jacob's increasing wealth. Eventually, God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland, promising to be with him. Fearing Laban's reaction, Jacob secretly gathered his family and flocks and left Haran. Laban pursued Jacob, but after a divine warning in a dream, he made peace with Jacob, and the 2 parted ways. Jacob's return to Canaan and reconciliation with Esau. As Jacob journeyed back to Canaan, he prepared to face Esau. Still unsure if his brother's anger had subsided, he sent messengers ahead with gifts for Esau, hoping to appease him. The messengers returned with the news that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men, which terrified Jacob. He divided his family and flocks into 2 groups, hoping that if one was attacked, the other could escape. That night, Jacob was left alone by the Jabbok River, and he had a mysterious encounter. A man appeared and wrestled with Jacob until daybreak. As they wrestled, the man touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it, but still, Jacob refused to let go until he received a blessing. The man blessed him and said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Genesis 32:28. Jacob realized he had wrestled with God himself, and he named the place Peniel, meaning, face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The next day, Jacob met Esau, who surprisingly embraced him with love and forgiveness. The brothers were reconciled, and Esau accepted Jacob's gifts, allowing Jacob to return to the land in peace. Jacob's later years. Jacob settled in Canaan, and his family continued to grow. However, his favoritism towards Joseph, the son of his beloved Rachel, caused jealousy among his other sons. This led to Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, a decision that would have profound consequences for the family. In his old age, Jacob would be reunited with Joseph, who had risen to a position of power in Egypt. Jacob and his family moved to Egypt to escape a famine, where Joseph cared for them. Jacob lived his final years in Egypt, and before his death, he blessed his sons, prophesying the destinies of the 12 tribes of Israel that would descend from them. Jacob died at the age of 147 and was buried in the family tomb in the land of Canaan. His life was marked by struggles, both with people and with God, but through it all, Jacob emerged as the father of a great nation, the nation of Israel. The story of Jacob wrestling with God is a pivotal and mysterious event that occurs in Genesis 32:20-32, during Jacob's return to his homeland after many years of living in Haran with his uncle Laban. This moment is not just a physical struggle, but also a spiritual turning point for Jacob, who had spent much of his life in conflict with others, including his brother Esau and his uncle Laban. Jacob's fear of Esau. Jacob had spent about 20 years away from his homeland, fleeing after deceiving his brother Esau out of both his birthright and blessing. Now, God had instructed him to return to Canaan, but Jacob was filled with fear and anxiety because he was about to meet Esau, who had sworn to kill him years before. As he prepared to meet Esau, he sent messengers with gifts, hoping to appease his brother. But when Jacob learned that Esau was approaching with 400 men, he became even more afraid. That night, Jacob sent his family and possessions across the Jabbok River, staying behind alone. It was during this time of solitude, worry, and fear that Jacob's mysterious encounter occurred. The Bible tells us that a man appeared and wrestled with Jacob throughout the night. The identity of this man is initially unclear, but later Jacob realizes that it is no ordinary human, and the text implies that Jacob wrestled with God himself. Some interpret this man as an angel of God, while others see it as a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Regardless, this was a divine being. The wrestling was intense, and it lasted all night. Even though Jacob was physically overpowered, He clung tightly to the figure and refused to let go. As dawn approached, the man realized Jacob would not release him, so he touched Jacob's hip socket, dislocating it. Despite the pain, Jacob still held on, refusing to let go unless he received a blessing, the blessing and name change. At this point, the man asked Jacob, "What is your name?" When Jacob responded, the man declared that Jacob's name would be changed to Israel, saying, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Genesis 32:28. The name, Jacob, means supplanter, or heel grabber, reflecting his earlier life of trickery and striving to get ahead of others, as seen with Esau and Laban. But the name Israel means, he struggles with God, or God prevails, marking a turning point in Jacob's life. It represented his transformation from someone who relied on cunning and deceit to someone who sought God's blessing and favor. Jacob's reaction. After receiving the blessing, Jacob asked the man for his name, but the man did not give it. Instead, he simply blessed Jacob and left. Jacob named the place Peniel, meaning face of God, because he realized that he had seen God face to face and yet survived. I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Genesis 32:30. Jacob limped away from the encounter due to the injury to his hip, which became a lasting physical reminder of his experience. This limp symbolized his dependence on God, a stark contrast to his previous self-reliant nature. The significance of the event. The wrestling match with God is rich with symbolic meaning. Struggle with God and self. This story is often seen as Jacob wrestling not just with God, but with himself, his fears, his guilt over past actions, and his desire for a different future. It reflects his lifelong tendency to manipulate situations and people, but now he is faced with wrestling for a genuine blessing from God. Transformation. Jacob's new name, Israel, signifies a transformation. No longer is he the deceiver or supplanter. Now he is someone who has prevailed with God and been changed. It marks the birth of a new identity, both for Jacob and for the nation that would come from him, the people of Israel. Divine encounter. The story shows a very personal and direct encounter with God, where Jacob's tenacity and refusal to let go until he is blessed symbolize his deep need for God's approval and favor. Despite his faults, Jacob's persistence in seeking God is rewarded with a blessing and a new destiny. Brokenness and dependence. The limp Jacob carries after his encounter is a lasting reminder of his dependence on God. It represents the humility and brokenness that often accompany spiritual growth and transformation. Jacob's strength is no longer in his ability to manipulate or overpower others, but in his relationship with God. Jacob's wrestling with God is one of the most powerful stories of transformation in the Bible. It illustrates how God often brings us to a point of struggle to help us confront our deepest fears, desires, and need for Him. After this encounter, Jacob was no longer the same person. He had a new identity, a new walk, and a renewed relationship with God. Jacob's dream at Bethel. Genesis 28:10-22. Jacob's journey and fear. The story of Jacob's dream at Bethel takes place after he deceived his father Isaac and took the blessing meant for his brother Esau. Because of his deceit, Esau became furious and threatened to kill him. In order to protect Jacob, his mother Rebekah sent him to her brother Laban in Haran, where he could find refuge and marry one of her relatives. On this journey, Jacob would experience one of the most significant encounters with God in his life. As Jacob traveled alone, he was likely filled with fear and uncertainty. He had left everything behind, his home, his family, and his security. Now, he was heading into an unknown future. In the midst of his fear, he stopped to rest one night at a place that would later become sacred to him. The dream, a ladder to heaven. Jacob stopped at a certain place for the night, using a stone for a pillow as he lay down to sleep. During the night, he had an extraordinary dream, and he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Genesis 28:12. In his dream, Jacob saw a ladder or stairway that stretched from earth to heaven, with angels moving up and down it. The latter symbolizes a direct connection between heaven and earth, between God and humanity. It is a vision of divine communication and activity, showing that God's presence is accessible, even in the most unexpected places. At the top of the ladder stood God, who spoke directly to Jacob, reassuring him with the same covenant promises that he had made to Abraham and Isaac. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 28:13-14. God promised to give Jacob and his descendants the land on which he was lying. This was a reaffirmation of the covenant made with Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. God also promised that Jacob's offspring would be numerous, like the dust of the earth, and that they would spread across the land, becoming a great nation. Most importantly, God assured Jacob that through his descendants, all the families of the earth would be blessed. This was a foreshadowing of the coming of the Messiah, who would be born from Jacob's lineage. In addition to these promises, God gave Jacob a personal assurance. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Genesis 28:15. This promise of God's presence and protection was deeply comforting to Jacob. It meant that even though he was fleeing from his home and venturing into an uncertain future, God would be with him every step of the way, ensuring that he would return safely to the land of his forefathers. Jacob's awakening and response. When Jacob awoke from his dream, he was filled with awe. He realized that he had experienced a divine encounter, and that the place where he had slept was holy. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Genesis 28:16-17. Jacob recognized that God's presence was not limited to the familiar or the expected. Even in a remote, unremarkable location, he had encountered God. He named the place Bethel, which means House of God. This name symbolized the special nature of the place as a site where heaven and earth met. In response to the dream and God's promises, Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as a pillar to mark the spot. He poured oil on the pillar as an act of consecration, dedicating the place to God. This marked the beginning of a sacred relationship between Jacob and God. Jacob then made a vow, committing himself to the Lord. If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you. Genesis 28:20-22. Jacob vowed that if God remained faithful to his promises, protecting him, providing for him, and bringing him back to his homeland, then Jacob would fully dedicate himself to serving God. He also promised to give a tenth of all his future blessings as an offering to God, a gesture of gratitude and devotion. Significance of the dream at Bethel. The dream at Bethel is a key moment in Jacob's spiritual journey, marking his personal encounter with God and his acceptance of the covenant promises. It has several important meanings. The latter symbolizes the connection between heaven and earth. God is not distant but is actively involved in human affairs, sending his angels and making his presence known to those he chooses. God's promise. The reaffirmation of the covenant promises originally made to Abraham and Isaac solidified Jacob's role as the heir of God's blessings. It also foreshadowed the nation of Israel's destiny and their role in blessing the world. God's presence in unlikely places. Jacob's realization that God was present even in a seemingly ordinary place reflects the truth that God can meet us anywhere, even in times of uncertainty and fear. Jacob's transformation. This encounter initiated a transformation in Jacob's life. While Jacob had been known for his deceit and manipulation, after this experience, he began to trust in God's plan for his life. The story of Jacob's dream at Bethel reveals a profound encounter with God in which Jacob received assurance of God's promises, protection, and presence. It marked the beginning of Jacob's deeper relationship with God and set the stage for the fulfillment of the covenant promises that would eventually lead to the formation of the nation of Israel. Bethel would forever be remembered as a sacred place, where heaven touched earth and where Jacob's faith in God was solidified. The story of Jacob's family life is filled with drama, rivalry, and divine intervention. Jacob's relationships with his wives, Leah and Rachel, and his quest to build a family are a central theme in Genesis 29:30. These chapters reveal how Jacob's marriages, struggles, and interactions with his wives shaped the foundation of what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. This story is full of emotional complexity, love, jealousy, competition, and the desire for children, all intertwined with God's overarching plan. Jacob's arrival in Haran and love for Rachel. After fleeing from his brother Esau, Jacob arrived in Haran, where his uncle Laban lived. Upon arrival, Jacob met Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, by a well. Rachel's beauty captivated Jacob, and he immediately fell in love with her. When he was introduced to Laban, Jacob stayed with him and eventually expressed his desire to marry Rachel. Laban agreed, but there was a condition. Jacob would have to work for Laban for 7 years to earn Rachel's hand in marriage. The Bible notes that Jacob's love for Rachel was so strong that the 7 years seemed like only a few days to him. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Genesis 29:20. Laban's deception, Leah instead of Rachel. When the 7 years of labor were completed, Jacob asked Laban for Rachel's hand in marriage. A wedding feast was prepared, but Laban deceived Jacob by secretly substituting his elder daughter Leah in place of Rachel on the wedding night. Because Leah was veiled, Jacob didn't realize the switch until the next morning, and in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Genesis 29:25. Furious at the deception, Jacob confronted Laban. Laban explained that in their culture, it was customary to marry off the older daughter before the younger. However, Laban promised to give Jacob Rachel, as well if he worked for him, another 7 years. Jacob agreed, and just 1 week after marrying Leah, he also married Rachel, the woman he truly loved. Thus, Jacob found himself with 2 wives, but this setup created immediate tension between the sisters, setting the stage for family conflict. Leah's pain and Rachel's jealousy. Although Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, Leah was the first to bear children. God, seeing that Leah was unloved, opened her womb, and she gave birth to 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Leah believed that each child would earn her Jacob's affection, but his heart remained with Rachel. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Genesis 29:31. Meanwhile, Rachel's inability to conceive became a source of deep frustration and jealousy. In ancient culture, a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to bear children, especially sons, who would carry on the family name. Rachel's barrenness left her feeling inadequate, and she became envious of Leah's growing family. In her desperation, Rachel confronted Jacob, demanding children. "Give me children, or I shall die." Genesis 30:1. Jacob, feeling powerless, reminded Rachel that it was God who controlled fertility. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Genesis 32. The rivalry intensifies, handmaidens as surrogates. In her desperation, Rachel followed a custom of the time and offered her maidservant, Bilhah, to Jacob as a surrogate wife. This practice allowed Bilhah to bear children on Rachel's behalf. Bilhah gave birth to 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali, whom Rachel claimed as her own. Not wanting to be outdone, Leah also offered her maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob as a surrogate. Zilpah bore 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. The rivalry between the sisters continued to grow, as they vied for Jacob's attention, and sought to outdo each other through childbearing. The mandrakes and more children. The tension between Leah and Rachel reached another level during the story of the mandrakes. One day, Leah's son Reuben found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother. Mandrakes were believed to be a fertility aid, so when Rachel saw them, she asked Leah for some. Leah, feeling neglected and undervalued, responded bitterly, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Genesis 30:15. Rachel agreed to let Jacob spend the night with Leah in exchange for the mandrakes. As a result, Leah conceived again and bore 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and later a daughter named Dinah. God remembers Rachel. Finally, after years of infertility, God remembered Rachel and answered her prayers. Rachel conceived and gave birth to a son named Joseph, whose name means, "May he add," indicating Rachel's hope that God would give her more children in the future. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph. Genesis 30:20-24. Joseph would go on to play a pivotal role in the history of Israel, becoming a favored son of Jacob and a central figure in the later stories of Genesis. Jacob's sons. By the end of this chapter, Jacob had fathered 11 sons through his wives and their maidservants. These sons would become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, those children, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and daughter Dinah. Rachel's children, Joseph, later Benjamin. Bilhah's children, Rachel's maidservant, Dan, Naphtali. Zilpah's children, El's maidservant, Gad, Asher. Jacob's struggles amid family rivalry. Jacob's family life was marked by intense rivalry and strife between Leah and Rachel, as they competed for Jacob's affection and sought to bear more children. While Leah was blessed with more children, Rachel was Jacob's true love, creating a dynamic of jealousy and pain. Despite the complexity and dysfunction within the family, God continued to work through the situation to fulfill his promises to Jacob. Each son born to Jacob played a role in the formation of the nation of Israel. Even in the midst of human flaws, God's plan unfolded, showing his sovereignty and faithfulness to the covenant. Jacob's complex family dynamics reflect the tensions, rivalries, and imperfections that can exist within families. Leah and Rachel's competition for Jacob's love and the battle over bearing children were emotionally charged. Yet God used these circumstances to shape the future of his chosen people, the nation of Israel. Through the birth of Jacob's sons, God's promise to make Jacob's descendants into a great nation was fulfilled. Despite human shortcomings, God's grace and plan prevailed, transforming this dysfunctional family into the foundation of his people. Jacob's vision at Beersheba, Genesis 46:1-4. The story of Jacob's vision at Beersheba is a key moment in the life of the patriarch, marking the beginning of his journey to Egypt and the continuation of God's covenant promises. After hearing the news that his long-lost son Joseph was alive and ruling in Egypt, Jacob faced a difficult decision: whether to leave the land of Canaan, the land promised by God, and move his family to Egypt during a severe famine. This journey had significant implications, and Jacob sought divine guidance before making such a monumental decision. Reuniting with Joseph. Jacob, now an old man, had endured much heartache in his life. Years earlier, he believed that his beloved son Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, but in reality, Joseph had been sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. Joseph's rise to power in Egypt, through a series of miraculous events, had placed him in a position to save not only Egypt, but also Jacob's family from starvation during a widespread famine. When Jacob learned that Joseph was alive and wanted him to come to Egypt, he was overjoyed but also faced a dilemma. Canaan was the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and himself. Moving to Egypt could seem like abandoning the promise, even though Joseph was urging him to come. At this crossroads, Jacob turned to God for guidance. The journey to Beersheba. As Jacob set out on his journey with his entire family, his sons, their wives, and all their children, he stopped at Beersheba, a significant location in the history of his family. Beersheba had been a place of worship for his father, Isaac, and his grandfather, Abraham. It was here that Jacob paused to offer sacrifices to God, seeking his guidance and reassurance before proceeding further. Beersheba, located on the southern edge of Canaan, symbolized a spiritual and geographical threshold for Jacob. Beyond Beersheba lay the desert and the unknown journey to Egypt. Jacob needed to know if God approved of this move, and if it aligned with the divine promises made to his ancestors. God's vision to Jacob. In response to Jacob's sacrifices and prayers, God appeared to him in a vision during the night, and spoke words of comfort and encouragement. God called to Jacob by name, and Jacob responded, and God spoke to Israel in visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Genesis 46:2. God reassured Jacob with a profound message, addressing his fears about leaving Canaan and moving to Egypt. I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. Genesis 46:3. God's message was twofold. Do not fear. God acknowledged Jacob's fears about leaving the promised land. Leaving Canaan could have been seen as a risky or disobedient act, but God told Jacob not to be afraid. God's presence and protection would accompany him. A great nation in Egypt, God revealed that the move to Egypt was not a departure from his promises, but rather a fulfillment of them. God would continue to bless Jacob and his descendants, and it was in Egypt that they would grow into a great nation. This promise echoed the covenant God had made with Abraham, promising countless descendants who would form a great nation. God's words affirmed that the move to Egypt was part of his divine plan and that Jacob's descendants would eventually return to the promised land, keeping the covenant alive. God's personal reassurance. God's promise to Jacob was also deeply personal. He assured Jacob that he would not be alone in this journey. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Genesis 46:4. This statement contains several important elements. God's presence. God promised to accompany Jacob on his journey to Egypt, ensuring that his presence would be with Jacob and his family every step of the way. Return to the promised land. God reassured Jacob that even though he would die in Egypt, his descendants would return to Canaan. This was a reminder that the covenant promise of the land was still in effect and that Egypt was a temporary stop in God's larger plan. Joseph's presence at Jacob's death. God gave Jacob a tender, comforting promise that his beloved son Joseph would be with him at the time of his death, and would close his eyes. This promise of a peaceful reunion with Joseph was especially meaningful for Jacob, who had believed for so many years that Joseph was dead. Jacob's journey continues. After receiving this divine reassurance, Jacob confidently continued his journey to Egypt, knowing that it was part of God's plan. With his sons, daughters, and grandchildren, he entered Egypt to reunite with Joseph and settle there during the famine. The vision at Beersheba marked a turning point in Jacob's life and the history of his family. It signaled the beginning of Israel's sojourn in Egypt, a period that would ultimately lead to their deliverance and the exodus from Egypt generations later. The promise that God would make Jacob's family into a great nation was fulfilled as the Israelites multiplied greatly during their time in Egypt. Jacob's vision at Beersheba holds deep significance. Within the biblical affirmation of God's faithfulness, God reaffirmed his covenant with Jacob, showing that even when circumstances seemed uncertain, his promises remained steadfast. God's guidance and presence. The vision demonstrated that God was guiding Jacob's steps, and that his presence would be with Jacob, even in a foreign land. It is a reminder that God is with his people wherever they go, even in times of great change or uncertainty. Foreshadowing of the Exodus. God's promise that he would bring you up again foreshadowed the eventual exodus of the Israelites from Egypt under Moses. Although Jacob would die in Egypt, his descendants would return to Canaan as part of God's grand plan for the nation of Israel. Jacob's vision at Beersheba was a divine confirmation that moving to Egypt was part of God's plan for him and his descendants. God's promises of protection, growth, and future return to the promised land gave Jacob the confidence to move forward without fear. This vision highlighted God's ongoing faithfulness to his covenant and foreshadowed the future events of Israel's journey from Egypt back to Canaan. Through this vision, God reassured Jacob that even in foreign lands, his plans would unfold, and his presence would never leave his people. Jacob's blessing of his sons. Genesis 49. As Jacob approached the end of his life, the time came for him to offer final blessings to his 12 sons. Genesis 49 records Jacob's prophetic blessings, which were more than just wishes or well-meaning words. They were divinely inspired pronouncements that foretold the future of each son and his descendants, the tribes of Israel. This moment was highly significant, as it established the roles and destinies of the 12 tribes that would arise from Jacob's sons. The blessings were a mix of commendation, rebuke, and prophecy, reflecting the unique characteristics of each son and their future role in the nation of Israel. Jacob's words would shape the history and identity of his descendants for generations to come. Gathering of the sons. As Jacob lay on his deathbed in Egypt, he summoned all of his sons to give them a final blessing. He made it clear that his words were not just blessings but prophecies concerning their future. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come." Genesis 49:1. Jacob's words were divinely inspired, revealing not only the immediate future of his sons, but also the destinies of the tribes that would descend from them. Reuben, the firstborn's lost preeminence. Jacob began with Reuben, his firstborn, who would traditionally have held a place of prominence and leadership. However, Reuben had forfeited his status through an act of great dishonor. He had slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Genesis 35:22. This sin led to a severe rebuke from Jacob. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Genesis 49:3-4. Though Reuben was born with the rights of the firstborn, his instability and impulsive nature caused him to lose his rightful place of leadership. His tribe would later become relatively insignificant in Israel's history. Simeon and Levi, brothers in violence. Next, Jacob addressed Simeon and Levi, his second and third sons. These brothers had acted together in a violent and deceitful manner, avenging the rape of their sister Dinah by slaughtering the men of Shechem. Genesis 34. Jacob condemned their actions, highlighting their cruelty. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. "Let my soul come not into their counsel, O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Genesis 49:5-7. As a result of their violent actions, Simeon and Levi were destined to be scattered among the tribes of Israel. Simeon's descendants became one of the weaker tribes, while Levi's descendants became the priestly tribe, with no inheritance of land but scattered throughout Israel to serve in the temple. Judah, the line of kings. Judah, Jacob's fourth son, received one of the most remarkable and positive blessings. Though he was not the firstborn, Judah had shown leadership among his brothers, particularly when he took responsibility for Benjamin's safety on their journey to Egypt. Genesis 44. Jacob's prophecy over Judah pointed to his future as the ruling tribe from which kings would come. "Judah, your brothers shall praise you, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, your father's sons shall bow down before you." Judah is a lion's cub from the prey. "My son, you have gone up." He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." Genesis 49:8-10. This blessing is a prophecy that the royal line of Israel would come from Judah. Indeed, from Judah's lineage came King David, and ultimately Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, who is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Revelation 5:5. Zebulun, the coastal tribe. Jacob's blessing for Zebulun, his sixth son, foretold that his descendants would dwell by the sea, and be involved in trade and maritime activity. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea, he shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. Genesis 49:13. Zebulun's tribe would later settle in the fertile coastal regions near the Mediterranean Sea, involved in commerce and trade. Issachar, the strong servant. Jacob's words about Issachar, his fifth son, described him as a strong and hard-working tribe, but one that would become subject to forced labor. Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant at forced labor. Genesis 49:14-15. Issachar's descendants would settle in fertile land, but their desire for peace and comfort would lead them to submit to other nations. Dan, a tribe of judges. Jacob's blessing for Dan highlighted his future role as a judge among Israel, but it also included a warning about Dan's cunning and treachery. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. Genesis 49:16-17. Dan's tribe would produce notable judges, like Samson, but the reference to the serpent may also foreshadow Dan's involvement in idolatry and treachery. Judges 18. Gad, the warrior tribe. Gad was blessed as a warrior tribe that would experience many attacks but ultimately triumph over its enemies. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Genesis 49:19. Gad's tribe, which settled on the east side of the Jordan River, would be vulnerable to enemy raids, but would also prove to be a fierce fighting force. Asher, abundance of riches. Jacob's blessing for Asher foretold that his tribe would dwell in a land of abundance and enjoy prosperity. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Genesis 49:20. Asher's descendants would live in a fertile region and produce food fit for royalty. Naphtali, the free spirit. Jacob described Naphtali as a free and swift tribe, likening him to a doe. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Genesis 49:21. Naphtali's descendants would be known for their agility and independence, dwelling in the mountainous regions of northern Israel. Joseph, the favored son. Jacob's blessing for Joseph, his beloved son by Rachel, was long and filled with imagery of fruitfulness, strength, and divine favor. Joseph had endured many hardships but had risen to great power in Egypt, and Jacob acknowledged that God had been with him throughout his trials. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely, yet his bough remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. Genesis 49:20-24. Jacob declared blessings upon Joseph, recognizing that God had protected and exalted him. Joseph's descendants, through his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh, would become two powerful and fruitful tribes in Israel. Benjamin, the warrior. Finally, Jacob blessed his youngest son, Benjamin, describing him as a fierce warrior. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey and at evening dividing the spoil. Genesis 49:27. Benjamin's tribe would later become known for its fierce fighters, including King Saul, Israel's first king. Conclusion: the 12 tribes. After blessing all his sons, Jacob concluded by saying that each blessing was appropriate for the individual son and their future tribe. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing, each with the blessing suitable to him. Genesis 49:28. Jacob's final words to his sons were a mixture of prophecy, rebuke, and promise. These blessings would shape the destiny of the 12 tribes of Israel, each fulfilling their role in the unfolding story of God's chosen people. Jacob's prophetic blessings demonstrated how God's plan for the future of Israel was interwoven with the character and actions of each of Jacob's sons. Despite their flaws and failures, God would use them to establish the nation of Israel through which his covenant promises would be fulfilled. May your spiritual journey be filled with God's grace and peace. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to inspire others on their walk with the Lord.